Next, in this section, we will discuss about the important concept like calculated column, calculated measure, and calculated table in DAX. Okay, first we will take a look at what is calculated column. The calculated columns, a calculated column is a new column created from two or more existing columns. For example, I just go to the Power BI desktop here, and I just go here and for example, here if you wanted to create a calculated column, you can go to the data view also, and then you can create a new table. Rather, what I do is I just go to the home ribbon and then I click on the, yeah, here also same thing. So here I'm talking about the calculated column. Click on the new column to create a calculated column. Okay, look here. Here I say something like here I have units sold and sales columns are there. If I wanted to find out the price, sales divided by units sold will give me the price, right? So you just think that way. Okay, this is a very simple logic. For illustration purpose, I'm using this simple logic. Okay, and sales by customers, sales divided by units sold. Units sold. So can you guys say if this one will work? Because I used the forward slash for division. And if I say press enter, yes, it is working fine. So 10232 divided by 10. So the for each product, the price is 1023, right? So for Baron, right, the product purchased by Baron, for that, the price is 1023. The product purchased by Larry, the price for the product purchased by Larry is 328. So I can see that, right? This is called your calculated column. It is a new column created from the other columns, two or more than two columns. In this case, I used a sales column. I use units sold. Sales divided by units sold. So we can also call it derived column. So we have derived this column based on this formula or based on these two columns. So in the calculated column, right? Sorry, this price, right, got calculated row by row in the data table. So in the case of calculated column, it uses row context. Remember, this is very important thing. Row context. A calculated column is often used as an intermediate step to obtain final result. Sometimes what we do is we will, supposing I want to find out the net margin, okay, profit. So in that case, what we do is first net margin percentage I want to find out, right? In that case, first we need to find out the net margin, and then only we need to find out the net margin percentage. Okay. So what we do is the net margin column is your intermediate step. In that case, you are using a calculated column, and then using that calculated column, you are going to compute the net sales net margin percentage. Okay. The other important point which you need to remember with calculated column is it is calculated at the time of refreshing the memory. What do you mean by refreshing the memory? Look here in the home ribbon, you have something called refresh, right? Or you can schedule the data refresh in the Power BI cloud service. Whenever the data gets refreshed, that time the calculated column will get created, or it will get created, okay? Or it will get refreshed, okay? So the calculation will happen at the time of refreshing the memory, okay? So it will not get recalculated when filter changes on the dashboard. For example, you are creating a visual here. Okay, for example, I just create a matrix visual. Not this one. Okay, let it be there. So in this case, I'm going to use this one. For example, I'm going to use a slicer here. And in the slicer, I just use if I select Baron, so Baron related records got filtered, right? So it got filtered. So here I have used the price calculated column, isn't it? Look here, the price. I just drag and drop it. So the Baron, we could see that the price for the product purchased by him was 1023, and for the other record, we could see that he purchased another product at the price of 706. Okay, 12 units he purchased it. Okay, so this is what we can see there. So this formula is not calculated when filter changes on this one, right? For example, if I go here, so in this case, if I filter the barren record, okay, and still the formula remains same, right? So look here, I can see that 1023 and 706. What formula I have used it? Sales divided by units sold. This formula is not getting changed here. Even if you use a slicer or so, that is what I meant here. It is calculated the time of refreshing the memory. It is not recalculated when filter changes on the dashboard. So we have another concept called measure. Look here, calculated measure. In the case of calculated measure, when you make any selection in the slicer, right, of based on the selection you made it, the calculations will be, see, it performs the computation based on the selection you made it. If you select barren, it does the calculation. Okay, the measure will get calculated for each, whenever you make any selection or whenever you apply any filter. Okay, whereas in the case of calculated column, it will not, the formula will not get recalculated. The calculated column will not get recalculated. It is pre-calculated and stored. Look here, in this case, we have pre-calculated the price. Then we store. So in this case, it is pre-calculated and stored. Okay, so that you can use it, wherever it is required. For in this case, we simply we have included this column price. Okay, and since this column has already been computed and stored as part of your table, it is available readily. And also, for example, if you want to create a slicer, for example, in the slicer, if you want to use the price, you can use it here. Okay, you can use it here directly. You can create, since this column, the calculated column price is part of our existing table, we can use the price column as part of your slicer. Whereas in the case of measure, you cannot use a measure in your slicer. Okay, you need to remember that one. So to recap, the calculated column, what is a calculated column? It is a new column created from two or more existing columns. It is calculated row by row in the table. Look here, 8482 divided by 12 and 10232 divided by 10. So it writes, and hence it uses the row context, which means the calculation is performed row by row in the data table. And then it is calculated at the time of refreshing the memory, and it is not recalculated whenever you apply any changes using your filter or slicer on your report or dashboard. It is pre-calculated and stored in your table. It is readily available. So, okay, what other situations can I use calculated column? For example, if you want to calculate the customer age, you can use this one. Okay, your date diff function is available. Using date diff function, you can find out the age or the difference between any two given date. You will get it, right? So in that case, you can return year as per our date diff function in order to get the age in terms of years. See, the age is a classic example. Okay, so the variable age, let's say you are creating a column, calculated column by the name of age, right? The age will not get changed based on a filter context. For example, you wanted to see the employees working in Pune, what is their age? You are applying the filter on the location wise. Pune, let's say in the slicer, you are selecting Pune. Just because you are selecting Pune, the calculation will not get changed, right? In Pune, whatever it uses same logic, right? So you are using a date diff function. What is the if you subtract the date of birth from your from current date, right? you will get the age in terms of years. This formula will not change when you apply any filter using your slicer. Okay, Pune location or Chennai or California. So whichever country or whichever the location you select it in the slicer, still the formula remains same. The today's date minus the birth date, that will give you the age, isn't it? This formula will not change just because I select different values in my slicer. That is what I'm trying to say. And other advantages with the calculated column is you can create something like cost bucket, something like that. Okay, so we can say if the unit price is less than 50, you can see low. And so when you create a cost bucket, you can see that in which bucket, how much sales we made it, right? So next one is, we will, so hope you understood what is calculated column. The column, when you create a calculated column, it is becoming part of your table itself. You need to remember this one. So let's say if you create more than one calculated column, obviously your model size will increase. In your table, when you add more number of columns, calculated columns, what will happen is it will take more space in your memory. Okay, that is one thing you need to remember it. Okay, you need to keep it into mind. So next one is the measure. What is a measure? Measures in Power BI are used for defining the calculation or formula. It helps us to perform any computations or calculations on your data as you interact with your reports. So in that kind of situation, we use measures. See, calculated column, you just think this way. A calculated column, when you use it, it will become part of your table column. So already you have 10 columns. Now you created a new calculated column based on the existing columns. So you have made this calculated column as part of the existing tables column. Okay, but when you use a measure, using measure also you can perform the calculations. Unlike a calculated column, whatever the calculations that you perform in your measure, that will not become part of your column. It is not a pre-calculated one. So in the previous example, price column was a calculated column. We pre-calculated the values for price column using the formula, some formula, right? So this sales amount divided by unit price. Now the next one is the measures are basically we use measures to perform aggregations. For example, you want to find out the sum of sales amount, average sales, and count of transactions in a given data set. It is not pre-calculated like a calculated column. You cannot see the calculated values in a table. Measure does not live in your data set. That is what I told you just now. Rather, it is calculated on the fly when called upon. Whenever you call the measure, only that time, whatever the calculations or whatever the formulas that used inside your measure will get calculated. It gets calculated on the fly. It is not stored in your data set. Okay. So, and it can be, measures can be used on other measures. For example, you have created a measure by the name of sum of sales amount. Okay, and sorry, you are using a DAX function called sum, using which you are find outing the total sales, and then you are storing this value into a measure by the name of total sales, right? The total sales, you got the total sales amount of your entire data record, entire data set, right? So that one will get stored in the total sales. For example, I just write it here. If I keep talk, I just show you. For example, I have a measure by the name of total sales. On the right side in the measure, I have used the function sum of sales fact. In this one, I have used the sales. Okay, the total sales is a measure. Okay, this measure I can reuse it in another function, another measure. Okay, that is what I meant. You don't have to do sum for each and everything. Since total sales measure already holds this value in it, you can simply reuse it. You don't have to, use sum of sales everywhere. Okay. That is what your total says. And that's what I mentioned. The measure can be reused on other measures, and measures will recalculate each time when you make any changes in your slicer. So let's say in your slicer, you are selecting north region. So what happens is that time it will compute the total sales for that specific region. For example, in Pune, what is the total sales? If I want to see that, let's say in the slicer, you have selected the city Pune. So the moment when you apply the slicer, when you apply the filter for Pune city, it will go and compute the total sales that time. Okay, since it is not pre-calculated like calculated column, so it is recalculating the measures each time. If you check for different cities sales, total sales, and if you make changes right every now and then, what will happen is it has to calculate the sale total sales amount for each and every city on the fly based on the selection that you make it. So in the case, it will consume too much of CPU. Any for example, you have a scenario wherein when you have to apply filter very more frequently for a specific visual. So in that visual, if you are using a measure, what will happen is since you are more frequently applying the slicer, right, or filter using a slicer, each time it has to recalculate the total sales for each city or so. So in that case, if the volume of the data is very high, it requires, it consumes too much of CPU, resource. Okay. There are two types of measure. One is the implicit measure, other one is explicit measure. The implicit measure is something like, auto summarization. This is done by Power BI automatically. It applies on the numeric columns, hence it is called implicit measure. For example, if I go to Power BI desktop, look here. If I go to look here, this is what my sales by customer table. And if you see here, these two columns, sales and units sold, right? So these two columns have a sigma symbol. This is what your sigma symbol next to them. So meaning, they are aggregates, sales and units sold or aggregates, right? Meaning they will be summed or averaged, right? So the any field in the fields pane with a sigma icon, it is a numeric and its values can be aggregated. For example, customer name, we don't see the sigma here. Hence, right, so this column need not to be aggregated. See, the implicit measure, for example, if I click on the sales here, if you look at the top here, I just selected sales here. And if you look at the top here, the summarization is sum. The default aggregation is sum here. Okay, the default aggregation is sum for the numeric data type. So you can change that here itself. Okay, for example, no, I won't do average, you can do it. But here, we don't do it usually. So what we do is, for example, if you have the visual here, you just go here. Supposing you have the sales, right? You just click on it and then you select sum or average minimum, whatever the aggregation that you need, you can use it. Supposing you want to see the average sales amount rather than total sales, you can click on average. You can select average here. Supposing you want to see maximum, you can select it here, where in this place itself. Okay. For example, this is my visual. Select that visual. Sorry, not this one and this one, right? So in this visual, whatever the column that I used, you can see it here also. And if you want to see the, for example, you don't want to see the total sales, right? Just click on the down arrow, and then it will open up with the various context menu. In the context menu, you can select sum, average. Instead of using sum, you can use average. In this case, I have not, don't summarize, has been selected. You can use sum or you can use average. Okay, that is what you can do it. Okay, so the net in the case of implicit measure, the sales and with all the numeric values, next to the numeric values, you can see the sigma icon. That is what your implicit measure. Okay, we don't have to write any measure. Like for example, in this case, measure, right? I have written a formula here or computation, right? Calculation. So in this case, we did not do anything. Behind the scene, it does the aggregation. Okay. The next one is explicit measure. Okay. Okay, now the question is, so explicit measure is what we write it. Okay, we cannot use the implicit measure all the time. And also it is not a best practice to use the implicit measure. Okay, it is not the best practice to use the implicit measure. Rather, you can write an explicit measure. Okay. And what is the difference between calculated column and measure? 100, it's a million dollar question. Okay. The calculated column, can you tell me what is the difference? When you create a calculated column, it will become part of your table. Pretty simple, right? And hence it is stored in memory. Since the calculated column are part of your table, it is stored in memory. Whereas measure is not stored in a column. Okay, it is not stored in a memory because the measure is not stored, the part of your table column. Okay. And in the case of calculated column, it calculates the formula or the business logic at the time of data refresh. And also it consumes memory especially when you use more than the multiple calculated column. It consumes more memory. Okay. And it performs row by row calculation. This is very, very important. Calculated column, as I showed you, right? So say quantity into price or the sales amount divided by unit sold, we arrive the price. So for each and every row, this calculation helps us to find out the price, wasn't it? So, that's why, we call this a row by row calculation. Okay. And for example, in the case of profit, if you want to find out the profit is simple formula is, sales minus cost. Okay. You want to find out, the profit for each and every record, right? So you can go for calculated column. Okay. And whereas in the case of measure, it is not stored in memory. It is calculated on the fly whenever you call the measure. What do you mean by call the measure? See, once you create a measure, you cannot see the value instantly. The what value it got stored in the measure, right? Whatever the calculation that you see, the output of the calculation, you cannot see it instantly. If you wanted to see it, you can use a visual. For example, chord visual, I used it. In the case of count family functions, when I demonstrated that, I used a chord visual. And I just dragged the measure into that chord visual. So that what happens is the whatever the value computed as part of the measure will get executed, the output will get displayed in your visual. So hence the measure is calculated on the fly. Okay, and as I told you, let's say if you are using a slicer and if there is a business requirement or reporting requirement, so the user should be allowed to apply the or select whatever the regions they want to see it. Let's say you are not only the region, city wise, right? Let's say in a country you have 3,000 cities are there. For each and every city, if you want to find out the total sales, it's a overkill because if you select each time different city, for each time it performs the aggregation. It calculates on the fly. Okay, it recalculates. Okay, it computes the value, the total sales for each and every city on the fly, because these values are not stored as part of your table, hence it is not readily available. It has to calculate, it has to recalculate based on the changes or whatever the filters you applied as part of a slicer. Hence it consumes CPU. Hope you know the difference between memory and CPU. Okay, central processing unit. And the next one is we use measure most of the cases if you want to perform aggregation. Okay, and for sales year to date, for example, you want to find out the year to date sales, we have a function called total YTD. So if you want to find out the aggregation, in general, if you want to perform any aggregation, then you can go for measure. So do you remember, I have calculated column. For example, if I do something like sales divided by unit price, unit sold. This is an aggregation. I did not use any sum, average, nothing, right? Sales divided by units sold gives me the price. Here, I did not use any aggregation. Average, sum, min, max, I did not do anything here. Okay, I just simply, calculate. I'm calculating the price. For this, I'm using this formula. That's all, or business logic. But whereas here, the sum of sales amount, sum, you are using it. Average, you just remember we use measure in general to perform an aggregation. And in the case of calculated column, we just evaluate an expression row by row. So in this case, the expression, or we compute or we calculate the formula in the case of calculated column. Okay. And other thing which you need to keep in mind is you cannot use measure in your slicer, or you cannot use filters. You cannot use measures as part of the slicer as well as in the filters at page and report levels. Okay. Okay. So in that kind of situation, you'll have to use the calculated column. Okay. If you are using a calculation as a source of your filter, you must use a calculated column. Okay. So this raises another question. So when to use calculated column and measure? Like I said, since you cannot use a measure as part of a slicer, if there is situations you need to use the computed value or the calculated or the column as part of your slicer, which is not available. Okay, let's say you have 10 columns, but you cannot use those 10 columns, or you cannot use those columns as part of your slicer. Let's say you have created a new column, calculated column based on the existing column. Okay, based on the calculated column which you created, if you want to use some kind of slicer, right, you can use the calculated column as part of your slicer, whereas you cannot use a measure as part of your slicer. So in that kind of situation, you can go for calculated column. Use the value as filter condition in a DAX query, defines an expression that is bound to current row, and use the values in rows or columns of a pivot table. Okay, in the case of pivot table, right, if you want to use the values in rows or columns, right, so in that case, you can go for calculated column. And if you want to use the calculated column, as part of a slicer, in that kind of situation, also we can go for calculated column. And when to use a measure? For example, you want to calculate a ratio, aggregation, calculate a percentage. Very simple. If you want to perform any aggregation, you go for measure. Calculated column, if you want to use a column as part of your measure, and that specific column which is not already available in my data set. So that lets us to create a calculated column based on some formula. So that column, calculated column, I can use it in a slicer. So hope you understood when to use calculated column and when to use measure. Okay, hope you understood, right? So the difference between the calculator column and measure and when to use which one. Okay.